Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
Okay, Ben, let's start in Russia because last week, Russian opposition leader and prominent Putin critic Alexei Navalny became seriously ill. He was on a flight from Siberia to Moscow, and doctors believe this was just the latest example of a Putin opponent being poisoned. So Navalny's spokeswoman said that he got sick after drinking tea at the airport in Siberia. After 2 days of wrangling with Russian authorities, Navalny was finally transferred to Berlin, Germany on Saturday morning for treatment and testing. Navalny supporters think that Russian authorities actually delayed his transfer in the hope that the poison would exit his system and I guess become untraceable. Russian doctors who first treated him tried to claim, just absurdly, that Navalny was suffering from low blood sugar. German doctors with him now say they believe he was poisoned with a chemical that interferes with the nervous system that can be found in chemical weapons. So this is a huge deal, Ben. I was thinking maybe we divide it into a couple parts. So maybe just start with like who Alexei Navalny is. You know him better than me, Ben, but I think maybe the simplest way to describe him is as an anti-corruption activist in a country where fighting corruption is incredibly dangerous. Navalny has said that Putin's political party is for crooks and thieves who are, quote, sucking the blood out of Russia. But he didn't just sling these accusations. He documented and publicized corruption by some of the most powerful people in Russia. For example, in 2017, Navalny released a report about how then Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev used a network of trusts and charities and offshore companies to disguise his ownership in these massive yachts, mansions, an Italian vineyard. The list goes on and on. Ben, you and I have talked on the show about how much better Obama and Medvedev got along, and frankly, the U.S. and Russia got along at that time when Medvedev was in charge. But this report makes clear that he was on the take, man. He was acquiring massive wealth through his position. The report includes, YouTube links to drone flyovers of Medvedev's 45,000 square foot ski chalet in Sochi, the compound he has in Tuscany. So Navalny rose to prominence in 2008 as a blogger. He led major protests in 2011. He was been thrown in jail multiple times, once for the bullshit charge of obstructing police. So Ben, I know you've interviewed Navalny before. What do you think people should know about him or maybe this incident?
Yeah, so as I continue to violate spoiler alerts on my book, which someday will come out, I did spend some time talking to Navalny for my book. And, really liked him. He's a very charismatic guy. Just to give a bit of a background on how he became this figure, it's pretty fascinating. He had been involved in politics, and then he made the decision to kind of leave traditional political party opposition and become essentially an anti-corruption blogger around 2008 or so. And he was really innovative, and he kind of doubled as an investigative journalist. This is why he's such a unique figure. And what he did that was so ingenious is he bought a very small amount of shares in each of the major Russian oil companies and used the fact that he was a shareholder to start suing them to expose their corruption, to expose essentially that they were skimming literally tens of billions of dollars off the top to middlemen in terms of how they sold their oil, all to enrich basically Putin cronies. And this made him an overnight sensation, a celebrity. Millions of people watch his YouTube videos. He was writing a blog about corruption every day and really galvanized Russian political opinion in a way that the opposition parties hadn't around this issue of corruption, that the corruption of Putin and his cronies is central to the Putin regime. And that made him a leader in those 2011 protests in Moscow. He ran for mayor of Moscow, and despite all kinds of intimidation, being kept off the airwaves, he still achieved a good vote total in the mid-30s, and frankly, he thinks, probably with some good reason, that there was electoral fraud that drove his vote totals down and denied him the chance to win that election. And he's maintained this voice, and he really is the leading opposition figure to Vladimir Putin in Russia. The most potent opposition figure to Vladimir Putin, in part because he's not just the typical, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, but he's not, your typical opposition figure. He's got this kind of unique persona. He's also, frankly, a little bit of a Russian nationalist himself. He's not kind of a typical liberal. He certainly supports a more democratic Russia, and we would certainly prefer Alexei Navalny being president. But that made him a more dangerous adversary, and so he's been detained and imprisoned a lot when I interviewed him, we talked about when he was poisoned. He was poisoned once in prison. And in the same
he's been poisoned repeatedly. I probably should have mentioned that in the lead up, but there was a lot to cover.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, in the
crazy.
same kind of bullshit thing, he was poisoned, got very sick once, and the Russian authorities claimed that he had an allergic reaction. And as he explained to me, he's never had allergies to anything. He's never had an allergic reaction. So he's a singular voice in Russia, an important voice, the most important opposition voice, the man who has done more to expose corruption than anything else, which is incredibly dangerous to Putin. And it's quite obvious what happened. I mean, because of that, they targeted him once again, and this time almost killed him. He was put into a coma.
Yeah, and so first of all, if Ben is going to offer spoilers of his book, we all have to agree to pre-order it. That is the deal. And Ben, I'm glad you brought up this nationalism thing, because one criticism you hear of Navalny is that he was willing to speak at like ultra-nationalist gatherings that featured far-right speakers. There was racist speeches delivered. Some of them, they were demagoguing immigrants, not from Navalny himself, but other speakers at these events. He also said that Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was illegal, but that the territory, quote, now de facto belongs to Russia. Basically, he said he wouldn't return it if he became president. I don't mean to criticize a guy who was just poisoned. And I think his views on Crimea are complicated in some ways, in that he was maybe intending to describe the reality on the ground as he sees it more than policy. But I also think it's worth trying to understand who these people are, maybe warts and all, so that we don't lionize them and that we understand them fully as we support like the anti-corruption efforts and some of the things they're doing that are incredibly brave.
Yeah, I talked to him about all this, and I have to say I found him an incredibly appealing figure. Despite, as you described, warts and all. On the far right thing, what happens in Russia is that there are these annual marches, basically in opposition to Putin, and everybody shows up. The far right shows up, the far left shows up, everybody in between, and Navalny participated in this. And look, he's against Putin. He thinks that there's a corrupt regime that is stealing the resources of the Russian people. And you've seen this in other countries where oppositions are willing to just throw a big tent over everybody who's in opposition and cooperate to some extent, and certainly to cooperate in street action.
Kasich, Ilhan Omar.
Well, no, in Hungary, there's a far-right party that is a part of this opposition bloc, right? And I've talked to Hungarian politicians who are like, I can't wait to get into the parliament and vigorously debate these people, but right now we're in an existential situation. I don't think Navalny is a far-right figure. I think he's a guy who's, basically sees himself as single-mindedly opposing the regime and its corruption. And on Crimea, I think similarly, like, it's complicated, but, essentially, I think he has serious problems with how Putin did what he did, and the justifications that Putin used and the lying that Putin did. But like a lot of Russians, believes that Crimea has this majority of Russian speakers, should be seen as distinct from the rest of Ukraine. I don't agree with that view, but I don't think he necessarily believes that it was right to send in Russian troops and annex the place. I do think, he's, as you said, responding to political realities. And when I talked to him, it was about how do you have a more legal process, potentially a new referendum in Crimea with international observers to determine its fate. Again, that still, I think, would violate the U.S. position that you can't just redraw maps, right? Mm-hmm. But Tommy, the fact that he has those views is what makes him a more dangerous political opponent to Putin, because those views are pretty mainstream Russian views. And again, this is the danger of Navalny. He's got his finger on the weakest spot, the biggest political vulnerability for Putin, which is his corruption. And he has a set of views that are not easy to categorize as, a Trojan horse for U.S. or European influence. They're mainstream Russian nationalist views, albeit wedded to a complete commitment to democracy and transparency. And he's very adamant about the need for a free press, for independent media, for free and fair elections, so he would be a monumental improvement over Vladimir Putin. And he's one of the only figures in Russia that I think people could look at it and think, well, maybe that guy could be president of Russia someday.
Yeah, and I don't mean to suggest that Kasich or Ilhan Omar in any way extreme. I was totally making a joke. Ben, I should note that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo finally released a statement about Navalny's poisoning on August 25th, which is today as we're recording this. So we're a weekly podcast, and we almost got to this subject faster than they did. But let's talk about just poison for a second, because Andrew Kramer at the New York Times did a really interesting deep dive into Russia's use of poison to murder or silence critics or political opponents. This has happened to investigative journalists, prominent anti-government activists, opposition leaders, dissidents, defectors, including some who spied for other countries. Here's some of the stuff that they used to poison people. Radioactive polonium-210, heavy metals, rare plant toxins, and nerve agents that can kill you just by touching them. Very fun stuff. Former Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko was fed a meal laced with dioxin, which is a chemical found in Agent Orange. That attack, which a lot of observers think was Russian-linked, it didn't kill him, but it horribly disfigured him. So this Times piece talks about how the former Soviet Union had secret research programs to develop these like tasteless, untraceable poisons. They tested them on prisoners at the time, which is really awful. The piece talks about how several activists were poisoned at airports or given substances in tea. So there's a pattern here. So Ben, just a couple thoughts. Like one, again, just when Trump is asked to criticize Putin and he does his like weird whataboutism thing where he blames the U.S. for something, just everyone remember, U.S. presidents don't murder their domestic political opponents or journalists. Second, why do you think Russians use these weird exotic poisons? Like some of Putin's opponents just get shot or beaten to death or thrown out of windows. Like none of it is subtle. Why use some exotic substance to attack Sergei Skripal, the Russian military officer turned double agent for the UK, or Navalny, when like everyone knows who was going after these guys and who did it? What are they hiding here, right? And then in this specific case, like doctors think Navalny is going to survive this. So, that's good news, obviously.
Well, I think that first of all, the fact that it took this long for a statement to get out means that the statement is completely useless, because the message that Vladimir Putin takes from that is that the United States doesn't give a shit, And what Mike Pompeo does, and he's done this on several occasions where Trump doesn't really want to do anything, is he waits a few days, then he puts out a statement so that later when he gets shit about it, maybe when he's running for president in a few years, he can say, well, I put out a statement. But the message to the world is that we don't care. And look, in the time period that it took for them to put out the statement, Germany was able to organize a medevac for Navalny to fly him from Siberia to Germany for medical treatment and demand an investigation, all before the United States government could even say anything. I think on poison, I think what Putin wants to do is intimidate and control people. And there's this widespread use of poison kind of sends a message to anybody. If you are considering speaking up against Vladimir Putin, you never know what cup of tea you drink, what meal you eat might cause a horrific reaction and even kill you. And there's something very ominous and controlling about that, maybe even more so than the idea of someone kicking in your door and shooting you, right? This idea that they're everywhere. They're in your food, they're in your tea. I think he wants that impression out there. And it's kind of like MBS with Khashoggi. Putin doesn't care that everybody knows he did this, And he'll deny it, but that's frankly bullshit. But they want it to be known that they poison oppositionists. They've done it in other countries. They've done it in the United Kingdom. There's some people who believe they've done it in the United States in some murky cases. And that's what he wants. He wants people to think that you're not safe anywhere in the world if you criticize Vladimir Putin. And that is a chilling reality that the United States and the world has to deal with, because we can't live in a world where you can just poison people anywhere with impunity if they criticize you. That's a dark future that we should all want to stand up against.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, in case you didn't get enough fascism, let's talk about the RNC for a bit. There was some foreign policy-focused content last night, so buckle up. I'm going to do this all in Kim Guilfoyle voice. So on Monday, they aired a taped conversation with Trump and 6 Americans who the U.S. government had helped bring home after they'd been held hostage abroad. There was a U.S. Navy veteran who had been held in Iran. There was a man who had been held for 2 months in Syria, a pastor who had been held in Turkey for 4 years. A few things about the discussion that they taped and released that was just weird. First, Trump invited a couple named Joshua Holt and Terry Holt, who had been held in Venezuela. Trump never addressed Mrs. Holt at all. She was never allowed to speak in the segment, which was just bizarre. Also, when Trump was talking to the guy who had been held hostage in Turkey for 4 years, Trump praised Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan, who was an authoritarian thug who just imprisoned this guy. Also, Trump ended the conversation about these horrifying experiences by saying, great stories, which I don't think is how most people view their time held hostage. Like, one last substantive point, Ben, is that, like, there are many hostages still being held around the world. And if Trump wants credit for getting those folks out, he should, welcome some more scrutiny about the times he has failed. For example, there was an American citizen named Mustafa Qasim who died recently in an Egyptian prison. I would like to know why Trump wasn't able to get President el-Sisi, who he has called his favorite dictator, to release Mustafa Qasim. Ben, you and I worked on some of these hostage-related issues together at the White House. You dealt with many more of these issues after I left, including trying to help friend of the pod Jason Rezaian get out of Iran, and supporting the family of Kayla Mueller, who was taken hostage by ISIS and was tragically killed in Syria. On Thursday, I noticed that Kayla's parents are going to speak at the RNC, so there'll be more conversation about these issues. What did you make of this hostage policy conversation?
Well, I think it was misleading and cynical and dangerous. It's misleading because, frankly, as you said, there's always American hostages in other countries. Tragically, nobody has a perfect record of getting them all out. And it's misleading because what about the people that weren't freed? What about the person who died in Egyptian prison? What about Otto Warmbier, the American who was killed in North Korea? And, Trump continues to call Kim his best friend. He's writing love letters to him. No more mention of Otto Warmbier now that it's no longer politically convenient for Trump to hold up that case. The second thing I'd say about how cynical it is, these families have been through something that none of us can imagine, a wrenching experience that brings up all kinds of emotions that I can only guess at and what that trauma is. And to take that emotion and to channel it into this kind of crude politics, to me, is beyond disturbing. And look, we celebrated hostages coming home. I negotiated the release of Alan Gross from a Cuban prison, and at the State of the Union, Obama referenced Alan Gross being there, and everybody applauded. But it would never have occurred to us to have Alan Gross go out and give a political speech, like at the Democratic convention, renominating Barack Obama. This just kind of blows through kind of the boundaries of what I think is, an appropriate way of dealing with a family's pain, to channel that into some partisan political agenda. But here's why it's dangerous. The reason it's dangerous is that in the grand scheme of things, the U.S. government has an overriding imperative to protect the security of our citizens, and so therefore hostages do become a foreign policy issue. But let's be clear here. It's not like Trump has solved major foreign policy challenges in getting these hostages out. But the message he's sending to every dictator around the world is, all I care about is being able to celebrate the release of some hostage as some great deal that I did. He's incentivizing the taking of American prisoners who can then be used to leverage things from the United States so that Trump can get people out and trot them out for his political gain. I honestly think that why would you not draw that calculation if you're another country? Because it's not like Trump has gone to war with these countries to free these hostages. It's been some transaction that he's engaged in, and so to me, the sum total of this, it's an incredible encapsulation of how disturbing his approach to foreign affairs is. It's a complete extension of his domestic political interest. He doesn't really care about the people involved, because imagine how painful it is for the families of those who have not been freed to have to watch that type of demonstration at the RNC. And I can't stress enough how much I'm worried that, if there's a second Trump term, God help us if there is, that he's sent this message out that as long as I can claim a win, because I got somebody out, then I'm cool, so go ahead, Erdogan, wrap someone up for a few years as long as I get them back and I can brag about that. I mean, just dark stuff.
It is dark stuff. And look, crossing inappropriate political lines with foreign policy is like the theme of this thing, because we're recording on Tuesday afternoon. tonight, insufferable blowhard turned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is going to speak. And so that in and of itself is unprecedented, right? It is illegal, unethical, and frankly, really weird to have a sitting Secretary of State speak at a political convention. As NBC News reported, one of 3 State Department political legal memos on this topic says in bolded text that, quote, Senate confirmed presidential appointees may not even attend a political party convention. It is crystal clear. But Ben, of course it gets worse. Pompeo is taping his speech in Jerusalem while on an official trip. So we haven't seen his remarks yet, but he's undoubtedly going to talk about this recently signed Israel-UAE deal, just thrusting that back into politics. Pompeo's flacks are pathetically trying to claim that he is doing this in his personal capacity and that the government isn't bearing any of the costs. But that is just ludicrous. The State Department has a plane. That plane flew him to Israel. He will be driven around and supported by State Department staff. He was apparently spotted filming something on top of the King David Hotel, which means his backdrop will be the old city of Jerusalem. And that venue is as visually appealing to evangelicals as pool boys are to Jerry Falwell Jr. And so, according to the Jerusalem Post, Pompeo left Israel and flew to Sudan, where he's the first Secretary of State to visit since Condi Rice in 2005. The White House suggested that Sudan could be next on the list of countries to normalize relations with Israel. Ben, what do you think about Mike Pompeo filming a fucking RNC video from Jerusalem?
I mean, there's no bottom with Mike Pompeo, so I guess I'm not surprised. But to break it down, it is completely illegal and unethical. How would 2012 Mike Pompeo have reacted if Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had delivered an address to the Democratic Convention extolling Barack Obama and attacking Republicans while on official trip as Secretary of State? That tells you everything you need to know about the bottomless well of hypocrisy that fuels Mike Pompeo. Obviously, it is an official visit. If he's at the obviously it is an official visit. Not only did he fly on that plane, but I can tell you from experience that the King David Hotel is where you stay if you're the U.S. government traveling to Israel. So that means his hotel room was paid for by you, the taxpayer. That means all the security infrastructure at that hotel was paid for by you, the taxpayers. The taxpayers are literally funding a political stunt for the Republican National Convention. And then let's get to the setting itself. I mean, for years, the sacrosanct words of AIPAC and other pro-Israel groups are don't politicize the U.S.-Israel relationship. It's meant to be bipartisan. It's meant to be about things that are bigger than petty partisan concerns. I cannot think of a more rote politicization of the U.S.-Israel relationship than the Secretary of State of the United States using Israel as a prop in the president's re-election campaign, using the old city of Jerusalem as a prop in the president's re-election campaign. And let's be clear about the audience he's speaking to, Tommy, as well, because it's not the Jewish state, and it's not even particularly Jewish voters in the United States. Donald Trump himself has said that the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, that was for the evangelicals. That was the phrase he used. Well, what is that for? It's because the evangelicals believe that Jews have to live in Israel, live in the old city of Jerusalem again, so that the rapture can come and all the Jews can be converted to Christianity. This is the wink-wink that's going on here. So you're going to tell me that these are the people that aren't politicizing the U.S.-Israel relationship when they're literally using it as an alternative stage for the 2020 Republican National Convention so they can speak to a bunch of evangelicals and appeal to their desire to see all Jews converted into Christians when the rapture comes? I mean, give me a break with this.
It is wild. I'm going to go on a little soapbox for 1 second because this dovetails with something that drives me crazy, which is candidates that try to do the right thing, be no more transparent or put in place ethics or lobbying reforms get screwed for it. For example, our old boss, Barack Obama, decided to release something called Waves records. They're basically White House visitor logs that tell you who's been meeting with who. Bush did not release those, right? In fact, progressive groups sued the Bush White House all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to figure out who Dick Cheney met with on his secret energy task force. It was a very big deal. Obama got 1 day of good press for releasing these records, and then we spent 8 years getting the shit kicked out of us every time some weird person visited the White House. Similarly, fundraising gets nitpicked to death, right? Candidates who don't take PAC money will deal with reports that say, well, you took money from people who work at the company, right? Never mind if it's some low-level person or the CEO. My point is, not that the press should be nice to candidates, but like that relationship should be adversarial. It should be hostile. That's a good thing for like clean government. But if we want politicians to be more ethical and transparent, we have to create political incentives for them to do so. Because right now, Trump could care less about any of this. Half the RNC is being filmed at the White House, which is totally illegal. It's a Hatch Act violation. And this morning, Politico referred to the White House itself as a, quote, breakout star of the convention, noting it's good to be president. We have to stop judging illegal or unethical activity on style points. End of speech.
And the reason it's so insane, too, is that if Barack Obama had done the same thing, they would not have granted him that the White House is a star. It would have been a massive, massive scandal from the press because they know that Democrats care about norms. And so Democrats are more easily shamed. And so the press shames them. And they also know that Trump doesn't care. And so they go right along with the whole optics play here. And at a certain point, I mean, I'm going to use, I hate to do this, but I'm going to use a sports metaphor, Tommy. Like,
please.
If Donald Trump is playing an NBA game and so is Joe Biden, and Donald Trump goes 1 for 20 from the field, and Joe Biden goes 18 for 20 from the field, that means that Joe Biden did a lot better than Donald Trump. But the way the press covers it is they'll cover like Joe Biden's 2 misses as equal to Donald Trump's 19 misses. There's this need to kind of, in the name of balance, kind of give equal weight to this stuff. So create huge problems and scandals around arcane things that Joe Biden might say or do that Republicans seize on. And then suddenly, we're giving a pass to Donald Trump politicizing the heart of American government, which he doesn't need to do it. Like there are plenty of places to go in Washington where he can give a speech. So to use the White House or Jerusalem as a backdrop to their convention just shows how utterly corrupted our foreign policy is and our politics. And it also shows how incapable our news media is at processing that and communicating that to the American people, because most Americans are not familiar with the Hatch Act. They wouldn't necessarily know that it's illegal and unethical and unprecedented to use the White House in this way. They have to be told that by the American news media, and they're not.
Yep, and it's got to be like the lead of the story. Last sort of foreign policy thing from last night was former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, spoke. I got to be honest with you, man. I don't remember a ton of it. She is one of those people who seems to support and talk about and reference a version of Donald Trump that doesn't actually exist in reality. I don't know if you watched her speech. Did you have thoughts?
I mean, my only thought about this is that Nikki Haley has somehow kind of emerged like unscathed, in the eyes, I think, of like official Washington and the news media, like despite being completely consistent in her support for Donald Trump. And the other thing is she's kind of held up as this foreign policy voice, like this person who has credibility of having been on the world stage. She was the ambassador to the UN for like a year and a half. Like this is not extensive foreign policy experience. And what did she do? Like, can anybody name a single thing what is Nikki Haley's big achievement at the UN? Like there is none. So this is another case of like, she's just kind of been granted this status as this person who's floated above the Trump scandals, who has this background of expertise in international affairs, when all she did was essentially serve Donald Trump at the UN during the year and a half in which he was taking a wrecking ball to America's reputation in the world, and then been a defender of Donald Trump ever since. So I just don't know why she's in this other category.
Yeah, they give her credit for being less bad than a lot of others, and like that just shouldn't be the standard. Okay, let's move on from the RNC because Ben, we have some rare, unequivocally good news, which is that the Africa Regional Certification Commission has declared the continent is now free of wild polio. This breakthrough is the result of a major vaccination campaign in Nigeria, which had up to 1,000 cases a year through the mid-2000s, and according to the BBC, accounted for more than half of all global polio cases a decade ago. The reporting on this subject can be a little confusing, right? Because there's another strain of polio that can emerge from people who have been vaccinated. But the key point, the thing everyone needs to know is that if you get vaccinated, you're protected from all these strains. So universal vaccination is key, and it's how you protect these populations. Vaccination campaigns have been difficult in Nigeria because there's a terrorist group called Boko Haram that makes parts of the country very difficult to reach. Doctors also have to battle conspiracy theories alleging that the vaccine is actually, an American plot to sterilize people. Maybe these Islamist groups live in Orange County. COVID-19 made everything harder, right? Because you couldn't travel. So this is a big achievement. The U.S. eradicated wild polio in 1979, which is also a great Smashing Pumpkins song. When the Global Polio Eradication Initiative was launched in 1988, the wild polio virus was present in more than 125 countries and paralyzed 350,000 people per year, according to the GPEI website. Now it's only found in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So we got to keep working on this, vaccination efforts to eradicate polio everywhere, because one person could bring it from Afghanistan to another country and we're off to the races. But huge credit to doctors, NGOs, funders like Bill Gates, and polio survivors in Nigeria who were key spokespeople to help encourage parents to vaccinate their kids. So good news. Fun to talk about good news.
Yeah, no, it's great news. I mean, and we had the same challenge in Nigeria. And I remember, we tried a lot of different approaches, including reaching out to imams who could go into some of these more rural areas and communicate to people in a credible voice. It wasn't, say, the U.S. government or some foreign health official about why these vaccinations were safe, why immunization was safe. It's harder than you'd think to do that. If you're living in a rural area without a lot of access to information, subject to a lot of conspiracy theories that vaccines are a Western plot. We've talked on this show, Tommy, about the kind of Russian information operation that HIV/AIDS was somehow a creation of the CIA. Well, that stuff permeated deep in Africa. So this is great news. And I think the other lesson of it, though, is that you can beat diseases. You can fight and win these fights against diseases, which obviously matters in the COVID-19 context. Yeah. It matters to HIV/AIDS. It matters to efforts to try to take on malaria and maternal death. I mean, I think the lesson here is that if you've got governments working with private philanthropists like Bill Gates, working with large NGOs, and working with local populations, you can save a lot of lives. And it's in our interest to do that from a humanitarian perspective, but also from the perspective that, as we've seen, disease spreads, right? So another reminder of the benefit of real international cooperation.
Yeah, very, very well said. Okay, let's go to Belarus, because there's still massive protests there. On Sunday, an estimated 100,000 people were in the streets protesting President Alexander Lukashenko and calling on him to step down. The super short version of the backstory, if you want the longer one, listen to the last few episodes, is that Lukashenko is a dictator who has led Belarus for the last 26 years. He tried to steal yet another election on August 9th. And the people of Belarus were not having it, and they've been protesting ever since. So the good news, Ben, is it seems like security forces are cracking down less hard. They're not arresting as many people. There are fewer reports of torture and abuse. But it is worrisome at the same time that Lukashenko keeps arresting high-profile opposition leaders and acting in a really defiant manner. Like, state media keeps running videos of him, like, jumping out of a helicopter with a machine gun and like generally looking threatening, which, in other words means he could get a speaking slot at the RNC. But the Deputy Secretary of State met with Lukashenko's opponent in that most recent election, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. They were in Lithuania, where she's now in hiding. Just before that meeting, though, ominously, the Russians released a statement alleging foreign interference in Belarus. And I guess Lukashenko and Putin have talked at least 3 times in the past week. So, Ben, this thing's ongoing. Like, what do you think people should be watching as this situation evolves?
Well, I think what the people of Belarus realized is that there's some strength in numbers, right? And so if everybody's turning out, and if workers aren't showing up at work, if the state media channels aren't, the people who work there aren't showing up at work, that they can't crack down on the whole country at the same time, And it's this kind of mass mobilization strategy that did work also for a time in Hong Kong, as we saw. So the inspiring thing is that they've really internalized a culture of protest that has allowed them to keep the heat on Lukashenko. I think the thing to watch and to be worried about is if over time, the mass mobilization begins to diminish, Lukashenko may be waiting for a smaller number of protests to crack down on. It's hard to go after hundreds of thousands of people, but if it shrinks to a few thousand in a few weeks, then those are the people that he might try to crack down on. That may not work, by the way, particularly if people are willing to go back on strike again and essentially paralyze the country in their insistence that there be some transition there, some credible election there too. But I'd be watching for does he try to wait them out and then crack down? Does Russia get more overtly involved, as we've discussed? And on this question of foreign interference, I think I was glad to see the Deputy Secretary of State meet with them. That's the right move. And I don't think we should be embarrassed by those charges. I mean, like sometimes, and I think sometimes in the Obama administration, we were too worried about being tarred with foreign interference. You know what? It's the right thing to do to stand with protesters who've been totally screwed by a corrupt authoritarian leader who just completely stole an election. Yeah. And so have your meetings with the opposition, let them say it's foreign interference, and tell them that it's not. And the people turning on the streets clearly know it's not. I was inspired to see the Baltic countries. There was like a human chain made. They went on for miles of people expressing solidarity with protesters in Belarus. If they want to call that foreign interference, if they want to call that NATO, fine, let them. But let's all do the right thing and support the people of Belarus here, because they've broken the fear factor in that country, and hopefully they can keep pushing and pushing until they get the change they deserve.
Yeah, agreed. And we will keep covering this one because it's very important. This story is infuriating. It's a story about how Stephen Miller and Donald Trump's vile anti-immigrant sentiment has seemingly infected every part of the government, including the State Department. So the State Department, Ben, is arguing in court that the daughter of two legally married U.S. citizens is not herself a U.S. citizen because the girl was born via a surrogate in Canada. State is pointing to policy written in the 1950s that says, quote, a child born abroad to a surrogate whose genetic parents are a U.S. citizen father and an anonymous egg donor is considered for citizenship purposes to be a person born out of wedlock, end quote. Of course, that policy was written before in vitro fertilization or same-sex marriage became legal. So the parents in this situation, Roe and Adiel Kaviti, are two legally married U.S. citizens who happen to be gay. In June, a judge ruled in favor of the Kaviti family, but the Trump administration is appealing because they are cruel, awful people. According to ABC News, Ben, at least two other same-sex couples are dealing with this same nightmare scenario where they could be separated from their own children. So again, just enraging that the State Department spends its time and money on this bigoted shit.
Yeah. What possible justification is there for it too? I mean, there's no... They're to be clear, they're going out of their way. They're devoting resources. Yes. People are spending time on this utter bullshit. This fight is over. It is legal for gay people to be married in this country, and to punish people like this, it is so petty and cruel. For what purpose? So you can kind of call up some right-wing leader in the U.S. and say, hey, see what we're doing? We're screwing this gay couple. I can't think of any other reason to do it. And by the way, I have a lot of people I know who are still at state, and I'm glad that people are sticking it out. But I would not work on this. I mean, no. This is just gross. And
you want to tear a 16-month-old away from two U.S. citizens? What is wrong with you?
Why? And
why?
And just say out loud the reasons why. Because there's no reason other than the fact that these people are LGBT and so therefore they're not people. They're lesser people. They're lesser parents. I mean, it's astonishing me that we're even having this argument. But unfortunately, as astonishing it is, I guess it's not, because it's Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and Mike Pompeo.
And Mike Pompeo. Yeah. Have fun. Catering to Jerry Falwell Jr. and the evangelicals from the King David Hotel on my dime. Couple more quick things. So let's turn to Mali. So last week there was a military coup in Mali. President Ibrahim Boubacar Keita announced his resignation just hours after members of Mali's military took control of an army camp near the capital, rounded up a bunch of top government officials, and basically took control. Some citizens in Mali actually took to the street in support of this coup, which came after months of protests. The coup leaders promised a transition to new elections, but I wouldn't bank on that quite yet. Yeah. Representatives from ECOWAS, which is a group of West African countries, are trying to negotiate a deal, but they're looking to return President Keita to power, and it doesn't seem like he even necessarily wants that. So Ben, you and I did a lot of work on northern Mali when I was still at the White House. It's a dangerous place. Al-Qaeda-linked fighters have been able to operate there pretty freely. The U.S. says they are suspending joint military cooperation with Mali. The French say they're going to continue counterterrorism operations in Mali. The French have a much longer, much more fraught history with the country. They controlled Mali and called it French Sudan from 1892 until 1960. Ben, I remember all these meetings we were in about these threats emanating from Mali back in like 2012, 2013. What do you think the risk is of like a safe haven developing there? And like, what do you think the path forward is to get through this coup, to get to a transition? Like, what entity should play a role? Is ECOWAS the right organization?
Yeah, so Mali, really, what happened after that period of time when there was that spike in threats is that the French intervened, and French troops went into Mali, and the French, the former colonial power, was kind of a bit of the de facto, muscle in Mali, but it has the characteristics of kind of a failed state in that there are deep geographic divisions, tribal divisions. There's this Islamist presence, and the French intervention was successful, I think, in dislodging a lot of those Al-Qaeda elements. But, like a lot of military interventions, not successful in supporting the development of a cohesive government, right? And so I think this is just a place that doesn't really it's quite close to a failed state. And in that case, the military is often the strongest authority. And when a leader is kind of corrupt and loses popular legitimacy, the military steps in. So it's that formula. I do think that ECOWAS, an organization that a lot of Americans probably haven't spent a lot of time thinking of, is actually been somewhat effective on some of these cases. I remember when we were in government, Tommy, you may recall Cote d'Ivoire, there was a leader who refused to step down after losing an election. ECOWAS really stepped in and helped resolve that situation, ensure a peaceful transition of power. So, this can be an effective regional organization. I think the UN should be heavily involved too. So if you have the regional authority in ECOWAS working with the United Nations and trying to figure out what the formula is to return to some form of elected government, but also to try to deal with some of the needs in the country to address the fact that not only do you need a front man for the government, but you need a government that can actually function. That ultimately is going to be the long-term necessity. And like it or not, the French are going to have to help play a critical role too. They're the ones with the relationships with the military in Mali, more so than the United States. So I think it's the people of Mali obviously working hopefully with ECOWAS, the regional organization, the UN, and then the French hopefully playing a constructive role with the military. That's what needs to happen.
Yeah, well, another thing we will watch closely. So I wanted to talk about a domestic issue in the U.S. and how it maybe connects abroad for a minute, because on Sunday we saw another video of the police shooting an unarmed black man in America. This incident happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin. A man named Jacob Blake was reportedly trying to break up a fight. The police arrived, but when Mr. Blake tried to get back into his car and leave, you can see a video of a cop shooting him in the back several times in front of 3 of his children. So it is just absolutely horrifying and heartbreaking and infuriating, especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder. So the good news is that Jacob Blake is in stable condition. And if you want to help out people who are now protesting in response, check out the Milwaukee Freedom Fund. But Ben, I wanted to raise this in conjunction with a really horrifying story I read in the New York Times recently about systemic police brutality in India. And because what the Times reported is that despite data that shows over 1,700 people were killed in Indian police custody last year, there have not been widespread protests or really any protests at all. And this was also true in India after George Floyd's murder, when you saw like global solidarity protests. And they sort of identified the reason as being because the majority of the victims in India are Muslims or low-caste Hindus. The Times quotes human rights groups saying that despite the fact that prisoners in India are routinely tortured to death, there hasn't been a single conviction for that crime between 2005 and 2018. So I wanted to raise this issue because we need to end police brutality in the U.S. to save lives, especially Black lives. But we also need to get our shit together so that we have the moral authority to pressure governments in other countries and places to end torture and end extrajudicial killings. And like, once again, hopefully provide some sort of moral leadership on this issue, because I guess, you've raised this point before, Ben. The moral leadership right now is coming from the protesters in the streets. And I guess that's something to be hopeful about, but it would be nice to have the State Department actually doing it.
Yeah. And as you say, the starting point is getting our own house in order and showing that we can acknowledge what's wrong here in the United States and take steps to fix it, both structural policy steps, but also societal steps. And then that gives you some authority to talk about these things in other countries. And if you're talking about India, first of all, everybody should follow, friend of the pod, Rana Ayub on Twitter.
Definitely.
Because part of what's happening there is the breakdown, both the societal breakdown and the policy breakdown. In terms of society, it's hard to know how much Donald Trump's words, his ascendancy, the direction of the country under his leadership, how much that filters down into the mind of a police officer who puts his knee on George Floyd's neck, or a police officer who shoots Jacob Blake in the back. But, I think it's a pretty safe bet that there's some causality there. And in India, what you have is a Hindu nationalist leader, Narendra Modi, who along with a lot of his inner circle, regularly engages in Hindu nationalist rhetoric, regularly diminishes Muslims. You've had the home minister in India refer to Muslims as termites, right? Kind of dehumanizing language. Imagine the sense of impunity that gives to police officers. Just as, from a policy perspective, you're not seeing consequences for police officers who kill black people in some cases in this country. You're not seeing accountability for a police officer in India. So we have to restore our moral authority. And then the question in these other countries is, can people take on both the societal kind of permission slip that is given for this kind of violence, and can there be policies put in place, maybe hopefully modeled on policies that are working here or in other places, about holding police officers accountable for this kind of extrajudicial violence?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, the targeting of these Muslims. I mean, the U.S. needs to do a better job of standing up for Muslim lives everywhere, in Xinjiang, China, in India. And then, I was very glad to see that Joe Biden said that on day one he will get rid of the Muslim ban. It was, I think, a pretty big oversight to not have a Muslim speaker in primetime at the DNC, because you have such a stigmatized community in the U.S. who I just think we need to go out of our way to acknowledge that treatment and to welcome them into the Democratic Party, bring people into our democracy as much as humanly possible and not treat someone like they're other, or else, of course, they're going to feel that way. Yeah,
no, I mean, there absolutely should have been a Muslim speaker at the convention. And also, look, I mean, the left has done a lot of work in this country, I think rightly, in highlighting the connection between the war on terrorism in this country and some of the things that have taken place since 9/11 in other countries. Mm-hmm. The reality is, when you have this kind of hyper-securitized approach to terrorism in this country, but to Muslims in this country, and profiling of Muslims, and you have the kind of rhetoric about radical Islam and the demagoguery about Muslims in this country, from Donald Trump to Ted Cruz on down. Well, China, if you look at the internal documents that were leaked about Xinjiang province, about the imprisonment of 1 million Uyghurs, they were citing the U.S. war on terror. And by the way, not in their public justifications. This wasn't just PR. Like, they were citing that securitized mindset.
Totally.
And so if you think that the way in which the U.S. has conducted itself in the war on terror, and I was a part of some of that in the Obama administration, we have to recognize and wrestle with the fact that a Modi, a Putin, a Xi, have drafted off of that in some of their actions. I'm not justifying what they did based on what we did, and what they've done often goes far beyond anything we've done. But we do have to realize that there are unintended consequences to this kind of hyper-focus / obsession with terrorism, and the way in which, particularly in the Republican Party, it's drifted into painting Muslims with a broad brush. That stuff travels. That stuff goes overseas. And that's why the Democratic Party needs to do better and be better, And I don't care if it's not great politics to have a Muslim speaker for, really? You're telling me that, and I'm not suggesting that this was the calculus, but if someone were to make the argument that, well, everything we have to do has to be about winning this election, well, it's also about standing for something. And I don't think a minute or two speech from a Muslim American was going to affect the election either way. I think that the point is we have to model the behavior we'd like to see in this country and around the world.
Yeah, and I also think there's a lot of Muslim voters who we should be reaching out to and trying to encourage to be a part of the process. Because, you're probably not going to vote if you feel like the Democrats and the Republicans both ignore or worse, stigmatize you. So,
Yeah.
It's a political lesson there too. Last thing, I'm just gonna do a quick roundup of China news because we're kind of running out of time. So first, CNN had this fascinating piece about a satellite photo that captured what they think was a Chinese submarine entering or exiting an underground base in the South China Sea. It's worth checking out because it's more of a visual story, Ben, than for podcasts. Second story, colleges and universities are worried that students in China and Hong Kong who are remotely attending classes in the US could be subject to China's national security law. That law basically gives Chinese authorities very wide latitude to prosecute people for essentially talking about subjects they don't like. So this is a big deal. Colleges are worried about, someone in Hong Kong streaming a course where they talk about Tiananmen Square or Tibet and that being recorded and used to prosecute those students or the teachers. It's forcing schools into this horrible place where they're either going to have to self-censor or figure out a way to protect these students as they do their work. And then the last thing we saw, Jordan Waller, our excellent producer, flagged this. Chinese regulators are waging a war against food waste. So it includes penalizing kids who have too many leftovers on their plates to the point where they might not be eligible for scholarships. That seems a little intense. It is a way of going after people who overorder at dinner to be polite or to show off for their relatives. And then it's targeting a Chinese internet fad called Big Stomach Kings, where people live stream themselves binge eating. Ben, don't take Xi Jinping to Coney Island for the hot dog eating contest. This does dovetail with, some floods and farms that have been ruined and, potential long-term concerns about food shortages in a country this big. But it was an interesting story. Ben, any part of that you want to jump on?
Well, on the last piece, I'm going to use it to plug Missing America.
Yes.
We really, in this episode, we really break down the kind of social control that the Chinese are starting to exert on everybody's lives, largely through technology, but the degree of kind of micromanagement of the citizenry in China is really mind-blowing, and I think goes beyond what most Americans are familiar with. And this is, yet another example. On the students, I mean, it's a tough and tragic circumstance. There's no easy answers. I hope that there's a way to address some of these issues over time that doesn't just inevitably lead to no Chinese students kind of studying at American universities.
Me too.
In the long run, that's bad for everything. That's bad for the United States and China avoiding conflict. That's bad for the United States forging people-to-people connections. That's frankly bad for human rights in China if they're kind of walled off from people in the rest of the world. So my hope is, as hard as it is to navigate, that colleges and universities kind of earnestly try to fight a way through. And it'll be easier when people aren't doing this virtually, obviously. And the goal should be to maintain this extraordinary linkage between Chinese students and American schools.